It was just another evening at the diner. The small, cozy place had a familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling food. The kitchen door swung open now and then, letting a burst of heat and the sound of busy chefs fill the air. It wasn't a fancy restaurant or a high-end cafe, but the diner was loved by the locals. It had a charm of its own, a place where people came to relax, enjoy a meal, and forget about the outside world for a while. Lena, the young waitress, moved quickly between the tables. She was used to the rush, the endless cycle of taking orders, serving food, and refilling coffee cups. She had been working at the diner for a few years, mostly because it was close to her mother's house. Her mother wasn't well, and the medical bills were piling up, but Lena tried to remain hopeful. She knew her mother needed the treatment, and she would do anything to help her. So, she worked as many shifts as she could, hoping one day things would get better. Tonight, like any other night, she was wearing her black apron, her hair tied back into a simple ponytail. She carried the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, but no one could tell from her smile. She was kind to every customer, even when they weren't kind to her. People sometimes complained about the food or the wait, but she didn't mind. She simply took it in stride. She knew it wasn't personal, and her goal was always to make the customers feel at home, no matter how difficult they might be. Then, as Lena walked to the counter to grab an order, the door opened. A man walked in, drenched by the rain. He was wearing a long, faded jacket, the kind that seemed to have seen better days. His shoes were worn, and his hair was messy. He didn't look like someone who belonged in a busy place like this. People in the diner gave him a second glance, whispering behind their menus and coffee cups. Most assumed he was another person who had nowhere else to go. Someone trying to find warmth in a meal at a cheap diner. Lena had seen people like this before. They came in from time to time, people who were down on their luck. She could tell that this man was one of them. But she didn't judge. She simply walked over to his table, offering him a warm smile. "Hey there. Welcome to the diner," she said in a friendly tone. "What can I get you today?" The man looked up, his eyes tired and worn. He had an almost distant look, like someone who was lost in his own thoughts. He looked at her for a moment, then slowly spoke. "Just a coffee, please, Black." His voice was soft, almost quiet. Lena nodded. "Coming right up." As she moved away to get his coffee, she couldn't help but notice something strange about him. There was something different about this man, but she couldn't place it. His eyes, though tired, seemed to have a certain calmness to them. His hands were rough, like he had done a lot of hard work, but they were steady, like someone who had been through more than his fair share of challenges. Lena didn't think too much about it. She grabbed his coffee and returned to his table, placing it gently in front of him. "Here you go," she said, offering another smile. He looked up at her and nodded. "Thank you." Lena couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about him, though. She had met hundreds of people in her time at the diner, but this man felt different. She didn't know why. But something about him made her feel as though she needed to pay more attention to him over the next few days. The man returned, always around the same time, just before the dinner rush. He'd sit at the same table by the window, always ordering the same thing, a black coffee. He never asked for anything else. Sometimes he'd stare out the window, lost in thought, as though he was trying to figure out something, or maybe just trying to forget something. Lena had begun to notice his pattern. Every day after his coffee, he would leave quietly, never saying much to anyone. But each time, Lena felt a strange pull, a feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. She wondered about his life. What was he running from? Or was he simply trying to get away from everything? One day, when he entered, there was something different about him. He looked a little less tired, a little more alert. But it wasn't just his appearance. There was something in his presence that felt stronger. He wasn't just some random guy who needed a break. There was something powerful about him, though it was hidden behind that simple, worn-out jacket. As Lena approached his table, she gave him a warm smile, as usual. "Hi there, coffee today?" The man looked up, and for the first time he smiled back. It wasn't a huge smile, but it was enough to make her pause for a moment. "Yes, thank you. Just the usual." She nodded and walked to the counter. As she was pouring his coffee, she noticed something strange. The man had been watching her for a while now. She didn't know why it made her nervous, but it did. Still, she didn't let it show. She carried the coffee to his table, setting it down gently. "Thank you," he said again. His voice a little softer than usual. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. Then she finally spoke. "Is there something else you'd like? A sandwich? Maybe a slice of pie?" He looked up at her, his eyes thoughtful. "No, thank you. I'm good." Lena stood there, unsure of what to say next. She didn't want to keep bothering him. But something in her gut told her to ask a simple question. "Are you all right?" She asked, her voice quiet. The man looked at her for a long moment, almost as though he hadn't expected the question. "I'm all right," he said finally. But there was something in his tone that made her feel like he wasn't telling the whole truth. "I don't mean to intrude," she said almost apologetically. "But if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." He looked at her again, his expression softening. For a moment, it seemed as though he was going to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he simply nodded. "Thank you," he said again. "But I'm all right." Lena smiled, turning to leave. But before she could walk away, he added something unexpected. "You're a good person," he said quietly. "I don't know how many people would have done what you did for me." Lena froze. She wasn't sure what he meant. "What did I do?" He simply looked at her, a faint smile crossing his lips. "You treated me like a person. Not like someone to ignore." He paused. "You're the only one who's done that." Lena didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure if he was joking or if he was serious. But she did know one thing. There was something about this man, something that made her feel as though he wasn't just some stranger. There was a story behind those tired eyes, and she was certain it was one worth hearing. The rest of the day passed, and Lena couldn't stop thinking about the man. Who was he? What had brought him to the diner? And why did she feel so drawn to him? She didn't know. But one thing was for sure, this wasn't just another customer. This man was different. The next few days felt like they had a new rhythm. The diner was busy as usual, with the familiar hum of chatter, clinking cutlery, and the occasional laughter of customers enjoying their meals. But something had changed. Lena couldn't stop thinking about the quiet man who had started showing up each evening. He sat by the window, always ordering just a black coffee and never asked for anything else. He had started to feel like part of the routine, almost as though he belonged there. Lena noticed that over the past few days he'd grown a little less quiet. He still didn't say much, but there was a subtle shift in the way he carried himself. He wasn't just some tired stranger anymore. He had a certain calm about him, a presence that made people take notice, even if they didn't understand it. And every time Lena served him his coffee, he would thank her with a quiet smile. It wasn't much, but for some reason it meant a lot to her. One rainy evening, the diner was packed. It was one of those nights where it felt like everyone decided to get dinner at the same time. People were squeezed into every corner, the clatter of plates filling the air. Lena had been running around, trying to manage orders and make sure everyone was taken care of. The usual rush of the evening had begun, but as the rain began to pour outside, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. A group of men had come in, loud and rowdy. They were joking and laughing as they sat down at a booth near the back. Lena could already tell they were the kind of customers who liked to cause trouble. She had seen them before. A group of friends who came in on the weekends, ordering too much and complaining about everything. Lena took their order, trying to keep the peace. But as soon as they got their drinks, the trouble started. They began making fun of people around them, whispering loud enough for everyone to hear. One of the men, a tall guy with a loud laugh, turned toward the quiet man by the window. "Hey, look at that guy," he said, pointing at him. "You think he's gonna order something more than just a coffee? Probably can't even afford a meal here." The other men laughed, some of them nodding. The laughter wasn't friendly. It wasn't just a joke. It was cruel. And for some reason, it made Lena feel uncomfortable. She glanced over at the quiet man. He didn't seem to notice them, his eyes still focused on the window as he sipped his coffee. But Lena could see the subtle tension in his shoulders. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't indifferent either. As the group's teasing grew louder, Lena decided she couldn't just stand by. She knew these men weren't going to stop on their own. But what could she do? She was just a waitress. They were paying customers, and it wasn't her place to get involved in their nonsense. Still, she couldn't ignore it. The man hadn't done anything to deserve their ridicule. He hadn't said a word to anyone. And yet, these men were making fun of him simply because he looked different, like they saw him as something less than them. Without thinking too much, Lena walked over to their table. The men stopped talking when they saw her approach. She stood there for a moment, gathering her thoughts, feeling the weight of their gazes on her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Please stop making fun of the man sitting by the window." The men looked at her, surprised. One of them scoffed. "What's the matter, sweetheart? You gonna defend him?" he said, rolling his eyes. Lena didn't flinch. She knew she had to stand her ground. "Yes, I am," she said. "You don't know anything about him. And it's not right to treat people like that just because they don't fit your idea of who belongs here." The man who had been laughing earlier looked at her with disbelief. "You're gonna tell me how to treat people now? He's just some nobody. Why should we care?" "Because everyone deserves respect," Lena replied. "No one should be made to feel less just because of how they look, especially not in here." For a moment, the group was silent. The man who had been talking the most shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But then another one, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward and smirked. "What's it to you? You work here. You're just a waitress. Who cares if we're having some fun?" Lena felt a little wave of anger rise in her chest, but she kept it in check. "It's not about fun. It's about dignity," she said, her voice steady. "You're crossing a line, and I'm not going to let it slide." The group stared at her for a long moment, the air thick with tension. Then, slowly, one of the men laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, but it wasn't friendly either. All right, we get it," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "We'll leave him alone. But you don't have to get all righteous about it." Lena didn't respond. She simply turned around and walked back to the quiet man's table. The diner felt a little quieter after that, as if everyone was holding their breath. Lena didn't look back at the group of men as she walked, but she could feel their eyes on her. She wasn't sure what they would do next, but she didn't care. She had done what felt right, and she wasn't going to let anyone push her around. When she reached the man by the window, she smiled at him, though she was still feeling the weight of the moment. "Sorry about that," she said, not really knowing what else to say. "I hope they didn't disturb you." The man looked up at her, his expression calm, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel like he understood. "No, thank you," he said softly. "You didn't have to do that." Lena shrugged, trying to brush off the tension. "It wasn't right. I'm glad I did." He nodded slowly, as if deep in thought. Then, after a long pause, he added, "You have a good heart." Lena felt her cheeks flush slightly, but she didn't let it show. She simply nodded, giving him a warm smile. "Well, if you need anything else, just let me know," she said, before turning back to check on the rest of the tables. As the night went on, the group of men grew quieter, eventually finishing their meal and leaving. They didn't say much to her when they paid. It seemed like the whole thing had deflated, but the tension lingered in the air for a while after they left. Lena didn't know if she had done the right thing. She hadn't wanted to cause trouble. She didn't want to risk her job over a confrontation. But deep down, she knew she couldn't just stand by and let people be treated unfairly. When the diner finally quieted down and she had a moment to herself, Lena glanced over at the quiet man. He had finished his coffee and was standing up to leave. He hadn't said much all night, but she felt like there was something more to him, something deeper that he hadn't shared yet. Before he left, he gave her a small smile and nodded. "Thank you again," he said quietly. "I appreciate your kindness." Lena smiled back, her heart warming. "Anytime," she said, as the man walked out the door and into the night. Lena stood there for a moment, thinking about what had just happened. She had no idea who he was or why he had been so quiet all this time. But she knew one thing for sure: he was different from the others who came in. There was something about him that made her feel like he wasn't just some random stranger. There was a story behind him, and Lena couldn't help but feel curious about what that story was. The days after the confrontation in the diner felt quieter, almost like the storm had passed. The group of men hadn't come back, and things slowly returned to normal. But for Lena, it felt different. She couldn't stop thinking about the man by the window. The quiet man who had sat alone, drinking coffee, and said almost nothing. The way he had looked at her when she defended him stayed with her. There had been something about his eyes that made her feel as though he understood more than he let on. She had always known that people came to the diner for all sorts of reasons. Some were just passing through. Others were regulars who seemed to have their own stories. But this man, he wasn't like the others. There was something about him that made her feel like there was more to him than met the eye. Lena didn't usually think too much about the customers. She couldn't afford to. She had too much to do. Between working long hours at the diner, checking in on her mother's condition, and keeping up with the bills, there wasn't much time to sit and wonder about the people she served. But something about this man had left a mark on her. He had stopped coming in for a few days, and Lena found herself looking out the window every time the door opened, hoping to see him walk through. But he didn't. The other customers came and went, but the man, the quiet stranger, was absent. Lena was just about to finish up her shift one evening when she heard the familiar sound of the doorbell. She turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat. There he was, walking in again. But this time something was different. He didn't look quite as tired as before. He wasn't dressed in the worn jacket anymore, and his hair was neatly combed. He was wearing a button-down shirt, a simple one, but it was clear that it was clean and well kept. He looked more polished in a way. Lena watched him for a moment as he made his way to the same table by the window. He sat down, his movements slow but deliberate. There was still a quiet energy about him, but it felt like something had shifted. She took a deep breath and walked over to his table. This time she wasn't as nervous. Maybe it was because she had seen him enough to know he wasn't a threat. But more than that, she had come to respect him without really understanding why. She offered him a warm smile as she reached his table. "Back again?" she said, trying to sound casual. "What can I get you today?" The man looked up at her, his eyes still soft but now a little more focused. "Just the usual," he said. "Coffee, black." Lena nodded, then hesitated for a moment. There was something in the air, a sense that this time there was more to this interaction. "You've been gone for a few days," she said, her voice gentle. "Everything okay?" He looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. For a moment he said nothing, just stared at her as if considering his words. Then after a long pause, he finally spoke. "I've been busy, had some things to take care of." Lena nodded, unsure of what to say. She had no idea what he meant by that, but she could tell there was something he wasn't sharing. He wasn't ready to talk about it, and that was okay. She wasn't trying to pry into his life. But there was a part of her that wanted to know more. As she walked back to the counter to get his coffee, she noticed that he seemed to be studying the room, his gaze sweeping over the other tables. He wasn't staring at anyone in particular, but there was a sense of observation about him, like he was noticing things that others didn't. Lena couldn't help but feel that he was sizing everything up, quietly absorbing the world around him. When she returned with his coffee, she placed it gently on the table in front of him. "Here you go," she said, offering another smile. "Anything else I can get you?" He shook his head, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in a while. "No, thank you." For a moment Lena stood there, unsure of what to say next. The silence between them felt comfortable, but there was still an unspoken connection in the air. She wasn't sure why, but she felt drawn to this man. Maybe it was because he had been kind to her without expecting anything in return. Or maybe it was because he had shown a kind of strength that wasn't obvious at first glance. As she stood there, just a few feet away from his table, she noticed that he seemed different than the first time she had met him. He wasn't hiding behind the worn jacket anymore. He wasn't pretending to be someone else. There was something about him now that made Lena think he wasn't just some guy who was passing through. He had a story, a past, and maybe even a future that was waiting to unfold. She couldn't help but wonder if she was a part of that story, Somehow, he broke the silence before she could say anything. You know, you're the only person who's been kind to me here. Lena blinked, surprised by his words. What do you mean? He leaned back in his chair slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. Most people, they don't see me, he said softly. They look at me, but they don't really see me. They don't care who I am or what I've been through. They make judgments without knowing anything. Lena's heart tightened. She knew exactly what he meant. She had seen it so many times, people making snap judgments about others based on how they looked or what they assumed. She had seen it happen to herself too, more than once. People didn't always see the full picture. They only saw what was on the surface. I don't think that's fair, she said quietly, her voice thoughtful. Everyone deserves to be treated like a person, not judged based on appearances. The man looked at her, his expression softening. I agree, he said, his voice low. But it's hard to find that kind of kindness in the world. Lena nodded, feeling a strange sense of connection to him. There was something about his words that resonated with her. She had always believed in kindness, but sometimes it felt like the world around her didn't share that same belief. People often got lost in their own lives, too busy to stop and see others for who they really were. Maybe it's not the world that's the problem, Lena said after a pause. Maybe it's the people in it. If more people were like you, the world would be a better place. He smiled, though it was a small smile, the kind that hinted at something deeper. Maybe, but you don't know what I've been through. Lena didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. She could tell that he wasn't ready to share his story yet. And that was okay. Everyone had their own struggles, their own burdens to carry. Some people carried their pain in silence, while others wore it on their sleeves. I don't need to know everything, she said softly. I just know that you deserve to be treated with respect. The man looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, Lena saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, quiet gratitude. It was the kind of gratitude that couldn't be put into words, but she could see it there in the way he held her gaze. Thank you, he said quietly. You're a good person. Lena felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It wasn't often that she heard someone say that to her, especially someone like him. But the fact that he had said it meant something. It meant that, despite everything he had been through, he saw something in her. Maybe they were two strangers in a world full of noise, but in that moment they had found a quiet connection. A connection that neither of them could explain, but both of them understood. As the evening went on, Lena continued to serve the other customers, but her mind kept drifting back to the man by the window. He was still sitting there, sipping his coffee, lost in thought. She wasn't sure when he would leave or if he would come back again the next day. But one thing was clear, this man had changed something in her. He had reminded her that kindness still existed even in the most unlikely places, and maybe, just maybe, he had come into her life for a reason. The days passed and the quiet man continued to visit the diner. But this time, things felt different. It wasn't just the way he dressed or the way he carried himself, it was the air around him. There was a certain calmness in his presence, and yet it felt like there was a storm waiting to break. Lena couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she could tell that something was about to change. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the diner was busier than usual. The lunch rush had come and gone, but now there were a few regulars scattered around, enjoying their meals and chatting with the staff. Lena was in the middle of taking an order when she heard the familiar sound of the door opening. She didn't think much of it at first until she heard the sound of footsteps approaching her. Lena turned around, her heart skipping a beat. There, standing at the entrance, was the quiet man. But this time, something was different. He wasn't wearing his usual worn-out jacket. He wasn't dressed like he had been for the past few weeks. Instead, he was wearing a sleek, black suit that looked like it had been custom-made. His hair was neatly styled, and there was a sharpness to his appearance that made him stand out from the crowd. For a moment, Lena didn't recognize him. She stared at him for a second, trying to process what she was seeing. This wasn't the same man who had been sitting at the table by the window, drinking coffee in silence. This was someone else, someone completely different. As she blinked, the man's eyes met hers. There was no mistaking it now. It was him, the same person, but transformed. He had gone from looking like someone who could blend into a crowd to someone who seemed to command attention without even trying. He gave her a small smile as he approached the counter. "Hello," he said, his voice calm and confident. "It's been a while." Lena's mouth went dry. She was caught off guard. "Yes," she said, trying to steady herself. You look different today." The man chuckled softly. "I suppose I do," he said, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "I figured it was time to make a change." Lena nodded, still trying to wrap her mind around what she was seeing. "Can I get you something?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. "The usual?" He shook his head. "No, not today. I think I'll try something different." "How about the special?" Lena smiled nervously and jotted down the order. She quickly turned and walked to the kitchen, her mind racing. She had so many questions, but she didn't know how to ask. Why was he dressed like that? What had happened to the man who had been sitting in the corner, lost in thought and drinking coffee alone? When she returned with his food, she couldn't help but notice the change in the way people were looking at him. The other customers in the diner had begun to whisper among themselves. The once quiet man now had a presence about him that seemed to make everyone in the room take notice. Some were glancing over at him, trying to act casual, while others stared outright. Lena knew that this man had been something of a mystery before, but now he was an enigma. She placed the plate in front of him, her hands shaking slightly. "Here you go," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The special." He nodded, still looking at her with that calm, steady gaze. "Thank you," he said quietly. Lena stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. She couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. The air felt heavier somehow, and she had a sense of anticipation building up inside her. As she turned to walk away, she heard the sound of the door opening again. This time it wasn't just any customer. It was a man in a sharp suit, flanked by two others in equally expensive clothing. They walked into the diner with a sense of purpose, their eyes scanning the room as they made their way toward the back. The group looked like they owned the place, and they carried themselves with an air of authority that immediately drew attention. Lena watched them with a mixture of curiosity and unease. She couldn't help but feel like something was off, like the universe had shifted in a way that she didn't understand. The new arrivals walked right past her and headed straight for the man in the suit by the window. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she watched them approach him. What was going on? Why were they heading straight for him? The man in the front, who looked like he was in charge, stood in front of the quiet man and looked him up and down. "Mr. Halle," the man said, his voice smooth and businesslike. "It's good to see you again." Lena's eyes widened in shock. Mr. Halle. The name didn't register at first, but it didn't take long for her to connect the dots. She had heard that name before on the news in business reports. Armand Halle, the billionaire. The man who ran one of the largest companies in the country. Lena couldn't believe it. The quiet man she had been serving all this time, the man who had seemed like just another regular customer, was a billionaire. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. He wasn't just some random stranger, he was one of the most powerful people in the world. She stood frozen for a moment, watching as Mr. Halle exchanged a few words with the other men. They were speaking in low tones, but it was clear that the conversation was important. The way they talked to him, the respect they showed, made it clear that he was someone they took seriously. Lena didn't know what to do. She felt like she was in the middle of something that she wasn't supposed to see, like she had stumbled into a world that was far beyond her reach. After a few minutes, the men in suits turned and walked away, leaving Mr. Halle sitting there, still as calm and collected as ever. Lena's mind was racing. How could this have happened? How had she not known who he really was? The quiet, unassuming man who had sat in the corner of the diner was a billionaire, a person who could change her life in an instant. If he chose to. Lena felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she walked back to his table. Her steps were slow, and her mind was a whirlwind of questions. She wasn't sure how to ask him what was going on. She didn't want to be disrespectful, But the shock of everything was almost too much to process. When she reached his table, he looked up at her, his expression unchanged. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm that Lena hesitated, trying to find the right words. I didn't know who you were," she said finally. "I mean, I knew you were different, but I had no idea you were him, Armin Halle, the billionaire." He smiled, but it wasn't a smug smile. It was a quiet, understanding smile, as if he had expected her to figure it out eventually. "I suppose I've been hiding in plain sight," he said, his voice low. "But I didn't come here for attention. I came here for something else." Lena's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady on hers. "I wanted to see if people would treat me differently if they didn't know who I was. I wanted to see if I could find some genuine kindness in a world that often doesn't seem to care." Lena felt her heart race. She hadn't expected that. The man she had been serving all this time, who had sat in the corner of the diner, unnoticed by so many, was searching for something real. Something that money couldn't buy? "I wanted to see if people would still treat me with respect, even if they didn't know who I was," he continued. "And you did. You treated me like anyone else." Lena was speechless. She had never thought of it that way before. She had simply treated him with kindness because that's who she was. But for him, it had meant something. It had meant more than she could have imagined. For a long moment, they both just sat there, silently understanding each other in a way that words couldn't quite capture. It was in that moment that Lena realized that this man, this billionaire, wasn't just looking for business deals or fame. He was searching for something deeper, something human, and somehow she had become a part of that search. Lena couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. The quiet man she had come to know as just another regular diner customer was Armin Halle, the billionaire. The news had hit her like a freight train, and her mind was still trying to process it all. But one thing stood out. He hadn't revealed his true identity to her in the usual way that people in his position might have. He hadn't flaunted his wealth or made it obvious. He hadn't used his status to get special treatment. He had simply come in, ordered his coffee, and sat in the corner, just like anyone else. There was a long pause as they sat there, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air between them. Lena was trying to piece together all the things she thought she knew about him. The man she had served for weeks was nothing like the businessman everyone in the city talked about. Armin Halle was not the kind of person who would typically come to a small, rundown diner. People like him didn't need to do things like that. They had everything they could ever want, but Armin had chosen this place. He had chosen to sit alone in the same spot, drinking his coffee and watching the world go by. He had chosen to be treated like everyone else, not as someone with a fortune in the bank. Lena cleared her throat and broke the silence. "So all this time you were just trying to see if people would treat you like a person?" Armin nodded slowly, his eyes not leaving hers. "Yes, I know it sounds strange, but I've had people around me for so long who only care about my wealth, my business, or my status. I wanted to find out if there was anyone who would treat me like me." He paused and added with a small smile, "And you did." Lena felt a rush of warmth at his words, but she couldn't help but feel a little uneasy too. She had been kind to him, not because he was a billionaire, but because he was a person who seemed to need a little kindness. She didn't know who he was when she first served him, and it had never crossed her mind to treat him differently from anyone else. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I had no idea who you were. I just saw someone who needed to be treated with respect. Everyone deserves that, right?" He nodded again, his expression softening. "That's what I've been hoping to find. People who see me for who I am, not for what I have." Lena sat down at the table across from him, the weight of the conversation starting to sink in. She had always believed in treating people equally, no matter their background or wealth. But this was different. Armin Halle wasn't just any person. He was a powerful figure in the business world, a man who could change entire industries with a single decision. And yet, here he was, sitting in a diner, drinking coffee and talking to her like they were equals. He had chosen to come here, to this small, humble place, where no one would recognize him. But why? Why the diner? She asked, genuinely curious. Why come here, of all places? Armand smiled, and there was a glint of something playful in his eyes. Because it's real. There's no pretense here. No one's trying to impress anyone. It's just life, you know? The world outside is so full of noise and distractions. But here, everything is simple. People are just living their lives. Lena thought about his words. She had always liked the diner for the same reasons. People came in for good food, good company, and a break from the busy world outside. It wasn't fancy, but it had something that the high-end restaurants and trendy cafes didn't. Honesty. People didn't come here to put on a show. They came here to be themselves. I guess I get that, she said, nodding. But doesn't it get lonely? I mean, you... Armand's smile faded slightly, and his expression turned thoughtful. Yes, it does. Sometimes it feels like there's no one I can trust. People want something from me all the time. My money, my connections, my influence. But that's not why I came here. Lena looked at him, her heart suddenly aching for him. She had always known that wealth didn't guarantee happiness. But hearing him speak about his loneliness made her realize just how much pressure he must have been under. He had everything except the one thing that really mattered. Genuine human connection. I didn't expect to find it here. Armand continued. But when I walked into this diner, when I met you, I realized something. You treated me like a normal person, not someone with a title or a bank account. You showed me kindness without wanting anything in return. That's rare. Lena wasn't sure how to respond. She had never expected anything in return. She had simply done what she believed was right. But now, hearing him speak about it, she realized just how much her actions had meant to him. After a long pause, she finally spoke. I don't know what to say. I've just been trying to do what's right, you know? I never thought about who you were. I never thought about anything but being kind. Armand looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite place. That's exactly it, he said softly. You didn't think about anything but being kind. And that's why it means so much. Lena felt a lump form in her throat. She had always wanted to make a difference in the world, to show people that kindness was still important. But she never imagined that something as simple as a smile, a cup of coffee, and a few kind words could mean so much to someone, especially not to someone like Armand. I don't know what you want from me, she said quietly. I don't have anything to offer. I'm just a waitress. Armand reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. The gesture was small, but it held a kind of weight. You've given me something more than I could ever ask for, he said. You've shown me that there's still hope for the world. That not everything is about money or power. Lena looked at him, her mind reeling. She couldn't quite understand why he was saying these things to her. She was just a simple person doing her job. But somehow, in this moment, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. She wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who had made a real impact on someone else's life, someone who had needed kindness, someone who had needed to be seen for who they truly were. What happens now? She asked, her voice soft. Armand took a deep breath, then slowly stood up from the table. I don't know what the future holds, he said, looking down at her with a serious expression. But I do know this, you've made a difference in my life. And for that, I'll always be grateful. Lena stood up too, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't know if I understand what this means, but I'm glad I could help. He smiled again, his eyes shining with something that felt like both peace and resolve. Maybe one day you will. But for now, I just want you to know that your kindness has changed my life. With that, he turned and walked toward the door, pausing just for a moment before he stepped out into the world beyond the diner. Lena stood there, watching him go, still trying to understand what had just happened. As the door closed behind him, the diner returned to its usual hum. But for Lena, everything felt different. The man who had been a mystery to her just a few weeks ago had left an indelible mark on her heart. She didn't know what would happen next, or if she would ever see him again. But she knew one thing for sure: kindness had the power to change lives, and maybe, just maybe, that was all that really mattered.